Good morning, everyone. It is on. So I need it? Yes, I'll use it. First of all, thank you for coming. I'm always both surprised and impressed that everybody still gravitates to the back of the room. And hopefully what we will have this morning is just a wonderful conversation with really one of the titans of the last 50 or 60 years of music and one of the great conductors of the world, Maestro David Zinman. Let me read to you a brief introduction about him. Maestro Zinman has conducted virtually every major orchestra in North America and Europe, including the Berlin Philharmonic, Orchestre de Paris, Concertgebouw, London Symphony, and countless others. He's been the conductor and music director of the Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, the Tonhalle Orchestra in Zurich, and also, of course, the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra from 1974 through 85. His extensive discography consists of more than 100 recordings of classic and contemporary music, and he has won 5 Grammy Awards, 2 Grand Prix du Disque, 2 Edison Prizes, the German Record Critics Prize, and a Gramophone Award. His Zurich recordings of the complete Beethoven symphonies have sold nearly 1 million copies. His 1990 recording of Heinrich Goretzky's Third Symphony with the London Sinfonietta with soprano Dawn Upshaw also became somewhat of a musical phenomenon. As a committed educator, Mr. Zinman has taught at the Curtis Institute of Music, and he served as the music director of the Aspen Music Festival from 1985 through 2009, where he founded the American Academy of Conducting at Aspen. Among his many awards, he received the Theodore Thomas Award presented by the Conductors Guild, quote, in recognition of outstanding achievement and extraordinary service to one's colleagues in advancing the art and science of conducting, reflecting honor on the profession. Please join me in welcoming as a distinguished visiting artist to Eastman, an American conductor whose career has been marked by the highest levels of artistry, imagination, and dedication, Maestro David Zinman. Well, welcome back to Rochester. We're thrilled to have you here, and we're thrilled to have you as a distinguished visitor at Eastman.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Great. So let me just start by asking if you would give us some background about your early experience in music and how you ended up from a young violinist to a great conductor.
Yeah, it's a long journey, actually. You know, I was born in Brooklyn, but we immediately went to where my parents were living in Croton-on-the-Hudson. My parents were devoted socialists, and that town actually had a lot of socialists and communists in it. But my father became a businessman and gave up socialism. So he always referred to himself as a Baron Bolshevik. And soon after I was about 3, we moved to the Bronx, and then we moved to another place in the Bronx. And I had a normal life, always playing on the street and getting into trouble. And my mother decided one day, a friend of hers gave her tickets to a recital in Carnegie Hall. And that recital was of the then young violinist Ruggero Ricci, who was still a prodigy. And after that recital, it was decided that I would have violin lessons. And of course, that was a horrible thing for me, because you know my only idea of the violin was Jack Benny playing on the radio, and that was pretty terrible. And so I thought, well, this is going to be awful. But what can I do? I came home one day, and my mother was very nervous because she was smoking a cigarette and she never smoked. So I knew something was up, and then she said, come into this room. And there on the table was a case, a violin case. And I thought, this is great, this is fantastic. You know, and I said, can I open it? And she said, absolutely, I opened it. And I was horrified because there was a violin. And she said, why are you so upset? I said, well, it's a violin. He said, well, what do you expect? He said, I expected a machine gun. And she said, why would I give you a machine gun? I said, well, because you love me. Because I only see, violin cases in gangster movies. So sure enough, one thing led to another, and I had to go. At that time, they had something called the Greenwich Music Settlement, which was down in Greenwich Village, and was free. You get free lessons. And the first thing, we went down on a Saturday, and there were all these kids with violins and so on, and I was going to have my first lesson. My first teacher was a Hungarian emigre called Fritz Rico, was his name. And he had all these little kids that he taught. And he taught in a very unusual way. The first day, you learn to hold the violin. And he did it by, he said, you know anything about cowboys and Indians? I said, of course I know about cowboys and Indians. He said, do a bow and arrow. So I said, hold the bow and arrow and pull it back like this. I said, you see that? I said, turn your hand like this. Turn the other hand like this. Stuck a violin, and there it was. So, there are 4 open strings, G, D, A, and E. Do that. Ah, pretty good. Not bad. He called it, he didn't call it a violin, he called it a violin. So I was having my first violin lesson. And when you had your first violin lesson, he showed you on a blackboard what G, D, A, and E looked like written. And then he said, you come upstairs after lunch and you play in the orchestra. This was very exciting. So went up, and there were all these kids at various levels. There were the open strings, which sat in the back. There were the people who played in the first position, people who could play in the third position, great people who could play in the fifth position, and so on. But he had arranged it all so that you could play any piece of music with the various positions. Now, if you play the open strings, it was like playing a piece of Boulez, because if you play, I used to sing overture, yom, bom, 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 ah, I didn't know what I was doing, but I just did what the kid next to me did. Of course, my mother she said, he's playing in an orchestra on his first day. She was all excited. And so that's how it started. It was, I hated playing the violin, but somehow you go through, in a very short time, I found myself playing these student concertos, Accolade, Sights, and then maybe you got to Viotti number 22. And once you finished Viotti number 22, you got to the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. And that was enough for me. I had to give up. I stopped at the age of 10. My mother was heartbroken. She said, you're ruining your life and mine too. And so I am very dry.
I would just tell you, I love the fact that you went right to the orchestra. I had dinner the other night with a woman who just picked up the cello again after having not touched it for 40 or 50 years, and said she loved the fact that in this orchestra we have of mostly senior citizens, she said, I was invited to play right away, and she said, I can't play those notes. And the conductor said, well, just play the ones you recognize.
Right. Well, I thought this guy had arranged everything, and so I thought he had written all this music. So it always said Wagner Rico, or Schubert Rico. That was his name. So I didn't know that Bach wrote music. It was only Rico. Anyway, I stopped, and then there was a long period where I didn't play at all, and just went out in the street and got in trouble. But it came time to go to high school, and the high school in my area was called DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and if you went there, you were going to be for sure a criminal. There was no doubt you'd end up in jail. And so my mother said, you've got to get into a good high school life. Stuyvesant or Bronx Science or something like that. And the only thing I could do was I couldn't really, my math wasn't good enough to get into Bronx Science or even Stuyvesant. And it looked like I was headed for DeWitt Clinton. But my mother had a great idea. She got a violin teacher who would come to the house who knew about baseball, because I was really mad about baseball at that time. And she said, this guy will teach you, and he knows all about baseball. So he came to the house and taught me and started me off again. I learned enough pieces to do the audition at Music and Art High School, which was in Manhattan at that time, 138th Street and Convent Avenue. And I went to school, and there were all kinds of kids. Some were children of really good musicians, and some were kids who had come from Europe, actually, and were there. And it was a fantastic school with 8 orchestras. And there I got to play a lot of music and play in an orchestra and start conducting. And that was how it all started.
Wonderful. So I know you went on to the Oberlin Conservatory, and you did work at the University of Minnesota. But how did you get involved in conducting, and what was your, I'm going to say, your break that really enabled you, that opened up the world of music to you as a conductor?
Well, I have to tell you that when I played in Fritz Rico's orchestra, he conducted, of course. And from the moment he lifted his hands, I knew I could do it better. So that was already the start for me. But when I got to high school, we were allowed to take a conducting course in the high school, and the students from that course got to conduct. And the first piece I ever did was Beethoven's First Symphony. I remember going down to Pedelson's Music on 56th Street and buying my first score for 25 cents. You can get half-price music or 10, anything off, and I used to go there and buy scores and try to pretend that I was a conductor. And yeah, I started in high school. I did some concerts. There was an article about me in the New York Times. It showed I was then, I think, 4'3", and conducting on a big raised podium. And, you know, bug bit me. And I got started there. And then, of course, when I went to college to Oberlin, I got a lot of chances to conduct there. And then I went to Tanglewood after Oberlin, and was in the conducting class there. And after that, I went out to the University of Minnesota, where I was studying composition. And I conducted the choir there, because the choir master quit in the middle of the season. I was his assistant, so I got to prepare choruses for the Minnesota Orchestra, or then the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. And I played as an extra in the Minneapolis Symphony and studied violin with my teacher there, Raphael Trion. But always conducting. I always had ad hoc ensembles that I put together. And yeah. And then after Tanglewood, I went and was part of Monte's school in Hancock, Maine. And that was an eye-opening place, because all the people who played in the orchestra were conductors as well. So you got to sit next to old people and young people, and very few actually non-conductors at that time. And it was great. It was it also opened your eyes to challenges. And then after Minnesota, I applied for an Italian government grant and a Fulbright scholarship to go to Italy to study conducting. And I told Montu about this that summer, and he said, "What are you going to Italy for? You know, the orchestras stink and the conductors are not very good, and why don't you come to London with me?" He was just appointed conductor of the London Symphony Orchestra, and be my assistant and study with me as well. And I'll get your scholarship changed. And that's what he did. Ended up in London and assisting him at the end of his life. That was the last 4 years of his life. and traveled around with him and carried his bag and took care of him whenever I could. He always had this little bag that he went with, had his shirts and his cologne, and I brushed his teeth and took care of his clothes and talked with him about music. He was a tremendous influence on me and a great conductor. And I really pretty much learned everything I know about conducting from him.
Is there anything in particular that you always recall about him when you're conducting throughout your career?
Yeah, he was a consummate professional, and he was an orchestra player himself, so he knew what they needed. And he was very clear. His technique was really based on his great model, which was Arthur Nikisch, who was a great conductor, one of the first conductors of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. And he had played under Nikisch in Paris, and he said, this is the best conductor. This is the one he learned the most from. And then he kind of passed that way of conducting on to me. And it was really just letting yourself be the music and doing that. And of course, he was very close to Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel, and also he loved Brahms, and he actually played in the string quartet that played for Brahms. I asked him, what did Brahms say? He said, I don't know. He only spoke German. We only spoke French. But he said he liked it anyway. But he loved Brahms's music, and yeah, he was a great, yeah. He did a lot of contemporary music when he was a young conductor. He worked with the Conductor Orchestra as the second conductor and did really pretty much a lot of modern music with them. And he was there a long time with them. He had been conductor of the Boston Symphony as well. And then San Francisco, he spent 30 years with them. So he was one of the most experienced conductors I've ever seen, and he was great because he only said the things that were important. And the best thing he told me is he said, if you know the music, it will come out of you. You don't have to think of anything else. Just think the music, get it inside you, and it will come out. And he had a fantastic memory. He learned from the solfege system, so he could solfege anything at a rapid rate. And it was good because the most important thing that he gave me was his confidence in me. He believed in me. I thought, well, if he believed in me, I guess I can do it.
That's fantastic. That's a mark of a great teacher. So you had a conducting career in Europe, and I'm curious at that time what the difference was between a conducting career in Europe versus America, and if that still holds true today.
Yeah, a little bit less than it did then. If you know, most of the American conductors, like Lauren Marcel or Bernstein, was a real exception. He always had a career in America as well as in Europe. But a lot of American conductors just went to Europe to make their career because they couldn't get one here. I mean, the boards of directors, I don't know if they were snobby or what, but they didn't really trust an American. And once I was asked at a talk that I was giving, what's it like to be an American conductor in America? I said, well, it's great because you can speak the vernacular, everyone knows what you're saying, and they understand what you're saying. But the hard thing is that they understand what you're saying. So there was that element. So I felt that I had to build my career as much as possible in Europe, and then I could come back. And my first job, actually, in America was here, in Rochester. And I came at a time when it was actually a difficult time. The orchestra was threatening to be pulled apart. There was a crisis with the board and with the orchestra musicians, and they had fired a number of orchestra musicians. And then a new board came in. They were called the Concerned Citizens of the Rochester Philharmonic. And they wanted a new conductor, and I was chosen. I came in, and I came into an orchestra that was really, it always has been a wonderful orchestra. And, it was a small orchestra, it was a core of players, but they were all wonderful musicians. And a lot of them taught here as well. And I learned a lot. I made a lot of mistakes as well, but I learned a lot. And but I always, when I talk about orchestras, I said the best one was my first one, which was the Rochester Philharmonic.
That's great.
Yeah.
So do you have any special stories or memories from that time with the RPO?
Yeah, well, a lot of wonderful things happened then. We were able to, I don't know what it was, but I was able to make contact with a lot of young soloists who were just starting their careers. And so we had wonderful solos here. And I remember one of the great things I did here was the first act of Valkyrie, with Jess Thomas and Jesse Norman and Thomas Paul. All of, and I think Jesse Norman cost about $500 for 3 performances, and Tom Paul, who's sitting out there, probably cost nothing. Did you get paid?
I have to pay a little fee for it.
Yeah. I think the most expensive was just Thomas, but it was one of the thrills of my life was to conduct that piece with those people. But we did a lot. We had Yo-Yo Ma before he was anybody, and Perlman and Zuckerman and Fima Bronfman and Jimmy Lin, and all these people came, and they weren't paid that much, but we had a great time here with them. And I was here for 11 seasons, and there are many highlights. I did all my Mahler symphonies here for the first time. I did my crazy science fiction Beethoven here for the first time. Some Bruckner symphonies, and was really able to spread my wings. And I learned a lot. I was kind of nasty sometimes to the players, but always with a good heart, I think. They knew that I wasn't really nasty at all, but they put up with my shenanigans very well. And so I still love them for that.
Fantastic. So we're going to ask one more question, and then it's up to you to ask questions. So if you don't have one prepared, you should start thinking about it now, and it will take one brave soul to ask the first question. The other thing that I have always admired about you and your career is you've always been a champion of new music. Mm-hmm. And I would love for you to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, well, I think that's the most important thing you can do as a conductor is to discover new music. And I always like, looking at music that hadn't been played before to see what I could make out of it, just looking at the dots, which were very fresh and interesting. And of course, I like certain types of new music more than others. And but I thought maybe, I could do a lot with young composers, and that's what had happened. I remember here we used to do something with Cornell University, where we had the orchestra go and play new music from Cornell composers. And one of the composers I remember really liking was a young composer called Christopher Rouse, and we played a piece of his, a very austere piece based on Sanskrit writings and so on. But I knew there was a real talent here. And then we played for the first time his piece called The Infernal Machine, which we played here in Rochester. And then we commissioned a very wild piece called Gorgon. It was so loud, my eyeballs used to spin when I conducted. And through Christopher Rouse, we got to be friends, and then I heard about many, he was a teacher as well. And I think he taught here, as and I heard about many young composers from him. So I began to have contacts with all these young composers. Michael Torkey, who also is an Eastman grad, and actually played the fourth Beethoven piano concerto with me and the orchestra when he was a pianist. In fact, I remember Renee Fleming, who I didn't know was anything, sang Scheherazade with me. She pointed that out to me. I said, God, was that you? But we had a lot of, a lot of young composers. And then when I went to Baltimore, of course, I took Christopher as my composer residence, and we kept up that relationship. So over the years, I did many, many premieres and made recordings of new music as much as we could.
Thank you for doing that. So what questions do you all have? Howard.
So, welcome back.
Thank you.
I first heard you conduct when I was a student at Oberlin, and I came home and heard the RPO play under you when I was on break.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I saw you give the first gesture, I said to myself, oh my God, this man must have had Velcros. Because I was having Velcros classes with Inda Howland at Oberlin.
Yeah, in the Howland, yes.
She was a big, I mean, she was overwhelming in it, so I was just wondering, I've been wanting to ask you for years.
Did I take Velcros?
Yeah.
Actually not, but I always used to look at the girls in their shorts as they did it through the window. But I didn't take Velcros. Sorry.
Interesting, okay.
Yeah.
When you were in Baltimore, and I lived in Salisbury, Maryland, and used to come up, I remember I used to tell people that the string sound that you got with the Baltimore Symphony reminded me very much of the sound that you used to get on the old organ recordings from the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I often wondered, how did he get such a magnificent string sound? That's the basic question, but if you could also relate that a bit to
I think,
your time in Zurich, where you started doing your Beethoven, for example, with quite a different sound.
well, I think, the sound the conductor gets from an orchestra is the one he wants to hear. And being a string player, I have to get that sound, and whatever I do with my gesture tries to make that sound. And I think it's, I don't know, maybe, when I was a kid, of course, I listened to, Philadelphia Orchestra with Ormandy, but also Stokowski, which had that rich sound. And but I was also fond of Toscanini, who had this kind of live, lean sound. And I thought that worked very well for Beethoven. So later on, when I was trying my so-called science fiction Beethoven, I tried to get that kind of crisp sound that you got from playing old instruments. But also, I was lucky in Zurich to have a very live hall. The Tonhalle is one of the best acoustical halls in the world. It has a wonderful bass sound. And you could play very, very short, and yet the sound rings and goes through. And that was pretty much ideal for the type of Beethoven that I wanted to do. Hope that answers your question.
I'm a young conductor, and I started here by a bunch of young conductors. My question to you is, what would you tell your young conductor self from your vantage point in your life now?
I
What would you tell yourself now? What would you tell young David Zinman as a conductor?
don't talk. Pretty much, that's what I say. And it's pretty much true. The orchestras don't want to hear you talk. If you talk, Montour used to say, don't talk for more than 10 seconds. And he said, 10 seconds is all an orchestral player can concentrate for. So, and he always used to say, he said, never asked them to count more than 10 back or forwards, said, because otherwise they'd have to take off their shoes. Great advice.
Hi, this is Zinman. I'm supposed here, and I never conducted before. I always play in the orchestra. I always had a confusion, like what would you describe, or like what's the most ideal relationship between a conductor and orchestra?
Let me repeat the question. So the question was, what's the most ideal relationship between the conductor and the orchestra members? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
The most ideal relationship is if you can inspire them to play, but let them play. In other words, that they have the feeling that they are playing and not you forcing them to play. And that's very hard to do, especially when you're a young conductor and you're trying to prove that you know something. You see, because the musicians say, well, this guy knows nothing because he didn't tell us anything. When you're old, of course, they know you must know something, otherwise you'd be dead. And so you just, as I say, allow them to play and find a way to allow them to play. You know, the difference is, for instance, if there's something that's tricky in the orchestra, and the musicians are kind of tense about it. And if you give them the feeling they can relax and play it, you know, and not worry, well, okay, we'll repeat it once. Doesn't go so well the next time. Maybe it'll go better. But if you can just tell them, just relax, you know, get over these 4 bars, and then you'll go on to something else. But it's really letting them play, essentially. Leading them, but letting them play.
This question probably goes nicely with the one you just answered. How do you adjust to a hall such as Berlin or Kleinhans or Carnegie Hall? What do you do to adjust to that hall with either the orchestra or the acoustics that that hall presents you?
Yeah, well, that's something that's a matter of judgment. And, you know, for instance, with this orchestra, we used to play in the Eastman Theater, which was a lot drier than it is now. And was very difficult. I can tell you, it was a difficult hall to play in. And so we always felt a release when we went to Carnegie Hall. You know, suddenly the orchestra could hear itself and make a lovely sound and so on. So that's a joy. Other times, for instance, the Tonhalle is a wonderful sound, you know. And then we would find ourselves in a terrible hall. And what are you going to do, you know? So I always say to them, just remember the sound you made in the Tonhalle and try to bring it to that hall. But every hall is different. Every hall has its own problems. And I say the most beautiful sounding hall I know is the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. But it's very tricky for the orchestra because if you hear the brass play where you're on the podium, it's too loud. So you have to get used to this various perspectives. And then, for instance, in an opera house, there's this it's very hard because when you're in the pit, you don't hear the singers as well as they do in the hall. So you have to make sure that you're not drowning them out, but yet you're not tamping the orchestra so much that they can't be heard. And it's a matter of experience, actually.
So yesterday, David conducted our Eastman School Symphony Orchestra and our Philharmonia. And I'm glad to say that he'll be coming back 3 more times over the next 18 months or so, and we'll continue to conduct those orchestras. But today he's working with our young conductors in master classes. So besides not speaking for more than 10 seconds or having musicians count back more than 10 bars, what advice do you give young conductors from, well, the entire time while you were working with the Aspen Music Festival and the conducting workshop there?
Well, every conducting student has a different problem. Some have no problems at all, but others have problems. And it's a matter of analyzing what they're doing. And so there's no one set method for for teaching conducting. I think what I like to point out is some basic technical things that sometimes conductors are only conducting with their elbows. And the orchestra actually watches, if you have a baton, they watch the tip of the baton. That tells them where to play. But if they're only seeing this, I used to talk about holding the baton. There was the ice cream cone, which you held it like this, and the stork, which you held it like that, or went like that. I think the baton has to be pretty much straight out, and you have to think of using your wrist a lot, and all these technical things. So you can deal. Some people actually have no technique at all, and yet get wonderful results from it. And that has to do with personal charisma, and has to do with projection, has to do with a number of things. So I don't try to change people who are actually succeeding. I try to point out, well, this is what's happening, and this is what you can do to make it better.
So beyond an individual's technique or things that an individual can do to improve, do you offer advice in terms of, upon graduation, here's how to build a career?
There's no one way to do that. If I think of some of my students at Aspen who now are starting careers and having careers, the most important thing you can do is to give them the confidence in themselves. I think that's the thing. I think if you just spend your time tearing someone down, it's not going to do them any good. But if they have the feeling that you believe in them, they're going to fly a bit more. And that's what I try to do. So every conductor is a different type. But there are certain types that orchestras like more than others. And if you can find that, you can point out to them, I think you're going to have a career because of this and that and the other. I think what's important also is to help them to get to know how to absorb the music into themselves. And everyone has a different method with that. My own method is actually by analysis. I analyze the music. I spend a lot of time with that kind of analysis. And once I've done the analysis, whether it's harmonic or thematic or rhythmic or whatever, or phrase lengths or something, once I've done all of that and the music is finally inside myself, then I can be free and let go. And I think that's important advice to young conductors. And sometimes, conductors take a long time to develop. Others, are immediately successful and do very well.
So let me ask a broader question, and that is, over the 50 or 60 years that you've been a professional conductor, have you seen the music world and the world of symphony orchestras change?
Yes,
and
of course.
If, based on that change, if you were sitting in my seat at the Eastman School of Music or all of the schools in the country, what should we be doing so that 50 years from now, the world of symphonic music is still very vibrant and very much a part of our culture?
That's a difficult question.
I started with the easy ones.
It's a difficult question because I think what everyone needs as a young musician is the opportunity to do it. The opportunity to play in an orchestra, the opportunity to perform, the opportunities to write music, the opportunities to administer, actually, as well, to learn about administration. I mean, when I was young, you came into an orchestra as a music director, you were expected to administrate, You had to do the auditions, you had to plan the programs, you had to, do all of these things. You didn't have an artistic administrator. You were the artistic administrator. You had to choose the soloists, all of these things. So I think if you can give people the opportunity to do that, to organize their own concerts, for instance, or plan a season or something like that. It's very important. And it's always a matter of taste, you know. I would say, you know, if an orchestra wanted to hire me, say, you're not hiring me for my conducting, but you're actually hiring me for my taste, you know, what I like and what I don't like. And sometimes it won't jive with what you have to do. But I think the most important thing about music education is giving people the opportunity and giving them the inspiration and helping them to be performers. And everyone is so worried, you know, when you're a young performer. Well, will I make it? Will I not make it? Will I screw up? Well, you know, I mean, everyone knows that feeling. You know, you're standing in front of an audience, and will I collapse? And, you know, and I was a gibbering wreck like everybody else, you know, but somehow you have to get through that. And I was lucky in that I had the opportunities to do that, and I had a teacher who helped me do that. And not only my violin teachers, but my chamber music teachers, the people who taught me composition, they all helped me and gave me the opportunity to do things. And I think that's the most important thing.
I just want to thank you. I was in the audience many years ago when you were here and was relatively new to classical music at the time, but in sharing experiences with people who remember you, the thing that we all felt about you was the amazing joy that you had from the moment you stepped on stage. And you sent that joy to all of us in the audience. And you conveyed that, you took us with you. And we still remember that.
That's
And
nice.
even sometimes when we talk about UC, and we'd say, oh, we're going to have that on the program, and I know Rochester doesn't like UC. But we would come and we would listen, and guess what? We all love it now. And you planted those seeds. And I think that's so important. And I still feel that you had, and we talk about conductors, you had an it factor. I still talk about it. And I think it's just your great joy and your love of what you do. You gave that to us.
Well, that's nice of you to say that. And, you know, I think the thing that always kept me going was, even though I hated practicing the violin and actually hated everything about studying or anything else like that, was that I loved music. And it was, you know, it was something I didn't like to talk about, actually, with my friends. You know, I felt there was something bad about that. But I still love music. I mean, I still, if I can't fall asleep at night and I can turn on the radio and listen to something and hear a piece I'd never heard before, it gives me great joy, of course. And but I think music is something that speaks very deeply to our humanity. And it's also a form of time travel, because we can feel what someone like Mozart felt, or Beethoven, or Bach, or, you know, way far away. And eventually people, you know, in the next century will get to understand what it was like to live in this century. And, you know, the world goes through a lot of turmoil and problems. But the thing that gives me hope is that the artists who make art, music, painting, literature, all these things are trying to deal with what our life is like and sort of have the best elements of humanity, carry that with them, and you know, keep that spark alive. And hopefully that won't go away.
Kind of as a follow-up question to that, some of us in the audience are in our 60s or 70s, or some would call it the downside of the mountain, not exactly probably our point of view. But for yourself at this point in your life, I guess you're in your mid-70s, where do you see yourself going in the future? And
Where do I see myself going? You know, I'm now 81, and I never thought I'd get to 81. And of course, when you're 81, you start experiencing health problems. And I've had 5 operations on this hand. I had a hip replacement. Yeah, I have other problems. And so you can no longer look forward, actually. So you can only look to do the best you can, to give as much as you can to young people, and hope they'll learn from you and benefit from your advice. I like working with young people because it keeps me young. It keeps me feeling, you know, I never think of myself as being old, you know, but I am old. And my body feels, when you get up in the morning, my knees can't quite work and so on. And everyone says, well, you know, that's normal. Well, you know, here, I'm still 13 years old, so it's hard. It's hard to deal with that. So I don't, you know, I don't see the future as, you know, I wish I could say, you know, in 10 years I'm going to do this. I don't know if I have 10 years, you know, probably not. And so what am I going to do with my time? I don't know. I just, I keep struggling, you know, between keeping working, of course, and the desire to retire. So, but then my wife says, if you retire, you'll just vegetate and go away. But I think having the opportunity to sometimes conduct, sometimes to teach, sometimes to just do nothing is a great thing. But everyone has that problem.
Perhaps the schedule is slower for you than it was 15 years ago, but could you share what your next 10 or 12 weeks look like for this?
The next 10 or 12 weeks, but just my schedule, in a way, is easier and harder. When you have a permanent office work, it gives you a base. And you have, you know, secretarial staff, you have people who are looking after you and so on. When you no longer have that, I don't have that anymore. You have to do it all yourself, and that's harder. But the problem is you're always engaged 3 or 4 years in advance. And so you always accept something in the future, not knowing if you'll be there. But for instance, next week, on Saturday, I go to Zurich, and I have Model 6 in Zurich, and then I have a week of teaching conducting there. And then I go to Amsterdam, and I do a concert version of the opera of Strauss Intermezzo. And then I go from there to Bamberg, and I do The Dream of Gerontius of Elgar. And then from there I go to I'm going to Prague. I'm going back to Zurich. Too many things.
It's quite the schedule.
Yeah, so I have
great.
10 weeks of actual guest conducting.
Yeah, fantastic. Barry.
How do you deal with all the different solos? I mean, we know sort of what Mozart is about. I would say there's a famous pianist who is not really good with Mozart, and there's someone that's good with Mozart. How do you deal with all that?
I think, yeah, when you are an accompanist, you're like a very good second violinist in a quartet. You have to adjust yourself to the pianist or the soloist mentality, and yeah, you have to be flexible. So, and you have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You know, I mean, there's some ways I would prefer, but sometimes you learn something different. But I've worked with a lot of really wonderful Mozart pianists, you know, and many of my friends were really good soloists and pianists, and it was always nice to have discussions with them. But I always had to keep an open mind, and that's the most important thing. And I always thought I was a very good second violinist in a quartet also. I could really match what was going on in front of me.
Laura.
Going back to your schedule, and I think everybody has a different point of view of what their work-life balance is, and I was wondering how you manage your work-life balance and how that's maybe changed throughout your career.
The problem with being a conductor is that you're continually studying. So you're always studying. There's always something coming up, and some of it you've done before. Even the stuff you've done before, you have to learn again. And so my wife says, I'm always at work, you know. I'm always copying parts, and I'm doing bowings, and I'm learning other things. But, you know, occasionally, you know, I have a chance to do nothing. And I used to like to play golf before my hip went, and so I'd make time for that. I like to read, but it ends up always, I started reading novels, but now I just read biographies and books about music, and because it interests me. But yeah, the life of a conductor is really preparation for what's coming next. Like any musician, I think.
David, being a violinist myself for so many years, and never got to really work on orchestral music until in my 20s, for that matter. What advice do you have for young people, especially string players, who most of the time their teachers don't deal with orchestral music? What advice do you have for the particular students that just don't do it? I mean, yes, besides the practicing of it, but most of them are going to become orchestral players.
You know, I think the answer to that is, of course, that you don't play music just to have a career, you know. You do it because you love it and you want to, or you want to conquer certain challenges that you have as an artist or as a technician. I don't think any violinist or instrumentalist ever stops learning, you know. They're always looking for some way to do it better. And there is no point where you kind of let it all sink down. You always have to keep going. And I think, thank God I don't have to play the violin anymore. Otherwise, I would still be practicing. There was a Pavel Berglund, a Finnish conductor, and you know, he drank a lot. And in order to keep himself from drinking, he took his violin along with him and spent all his time in the dressing room practicing when he wasn't conducting to play the violin. You know, no one ever heard him play the violin, but it was something that he did. I know I have another friend who's a pianist, and he's not happy unless he's playing 6 or 7 hours a day. You know, so it's a hard life, I think,
You know,
but fun.
I was going to say, I feel like no matter where we're at or what profession we're in, we inherit certain things. Some are good and some are not so good. I've always felt very grateful that here at Eastman, there are two things that all of us inherited that none of us had anything to do with. And one is on the facade of the building, it says that this building was erected for the enrichment of community life. And when I think about music, that's what I think music's purpose is to bring beauty and humanity to life. And the other is the university's motto, which is Meliora, ever better. And I thought, what a great motto for a musician. Is there any group that is ever striving more than musicians to be ever better. And so I love the way you talked about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're at the end of our hour, and I want to first say that David Zinman is here not just for today or for this week, but he will be back 3 more times over the next several months as a visiting distinguished artist. And I want to thank and recognize Dawn Lipson for enabling this to happen. So Dawn, thank you so much for supporting us. And I mostly want to thank you for enriching our lives with amazing music, both here in Rochester and through your hundreds of recordings. And thank you for today, and we can't wait to have you back in the fall again.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
Look forward to it.